So much, Kayla. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're calling in from. I'm Mary Beth Schnaber-Remrev. I'm the Director of Organizational Capacity Building here at the Partnership. We are really excited for our webinar today and to present this in partnership with our good friends at CAPLAW, Caroline Kelly and Jonathan Cohen. We're going to talk about effective board meeting minutes and resolutions, and also talk about a new tool that was developed to help your organization keep effective minutes and resolutions. But before we dive into that, we'll go to the next slide, and let's just take a moment to center ourselves in our promise and really remember why our work matters. So please, wherever you are in the country, feel free to recite this along with me. Let's recite our promise. Community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. Thank you. I could hear all of you from here in Louisville, Kentucky. So also with this, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the land from which our meeting is held today and pay respect to the people of that land. We encourage you to take a moment to identify whose land you are joining from, and take a moment to share gratitude and pay respect to its peoples. You can share your land acknowledgement in the chat. So we're going to acknowledge the land on which our national offices are. So the CAPLAW offices are on the traditional lands of the Pawtucket people, and the National Community Action Partnership offices are on the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people land. We pay our respects to the elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Thank you. So today's agenda, we're going to cover some general considerations for effective board minutes and resolutions. We're going to talk about some practice specifics. We're also going to introduce you to our new tool that was done in partnership with CAPLAW. And then we're going to get through a few hypothetical situations. CAPLAW has developed some awesome hypotheticals for us to talk through. And then we'll wrap up with some time for questions. So as we're going, feel free to put comments and questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will keep track of those. So with that, I think I am passing it off to you, Jonathan.
Right, thanks, Mary Beth, and thank you everyone for being here today to talk about board meeting minutes and board resolutions and the important new resource that we've put out. We're very excited about it, and just to give you an overview of what we're essentially talking about. I'll start with an overview of minutes and resolutions of the board and some examples, and then a purpose, or the purpose of having these for your board meetings, and then we'll keep going with some other stuff a little later. But just to get started, just to set sort of the context of what we're talking about, board meeting minutes versus board resolutions. So when we're talking about board minutes, we're really talking about a written chronological record of the board meeting that your board members attend, and essentially talking about what happened at that meeting. And we'll get into some of the details about what's included in this and what's included in the resource. But that's essentially what you're doing. You're creating a record of the meeting, of what went on there, who was there. So you have a record of attendance. In terms of board meetings, you might have guests, you might have members of the staff who've been invited to attend, and that should be all recorded in the minutes as well. And you're really describing key items that were presented there, key items that were discussed, how those discussions went. And then when we're talking about board resolutions, the text of official board actions and votes taken at a board meeting, very important to show that your board has taken formal action, taken formal votes on various issues, made decisions, and made different resolutions related to those decisions. These are typically incorporated into the minutes, and we have an index of form resolutions that we're going to be talking about. Caroline's going to be talking about a little later, and so some commonly seen resolutions from CAA boards, but those are there too. Sometimes it's also kept separately as a reference, so as a quick reference for boards that need to go back and see, for whatever reason, why a particular resolution was made, if it was made, who vote, what was the vote unanimous, things like keeping track of those types of things, and whether a quorum was present. So that's a general overview. Here's a few examples of what I'm talking about here, and you'll see this in the resource as well. Board minutes, you're talking about things like, here's an example: the meeting was called to order at 8:30 a.m. So making sure you're keeping track that, one, the meeting was called to order, so it did start, and it's important to note when it started, so when things happened at a meeting, chronologically, and you're keeping track of those chronological events. In addition, as I mentioned above, it's about keeping track of what was discussed, what were the key items discussed by board members. And so here's another example. Cindy asked why the accounts receivable was lower than it was this quarter last year. And so showing that a board member was actively engaged in a discussion, actively engaged in asking questions about something that was being presented at a board meeting, key to among other things, show that that board member was fulfilling her fiduciary duty, and we'll get into that in a slide or two as well. That's something that you could see in board meeting minutes as well. Details about a question asked or a discussion that was going on, as opposed to board resolutions, which were really, here are some examples of that. The board voted unanimously to approve the appointment of the new executive director. So here you see text that explains what the resolution was. It was unanimous. It was to approve appointment of a new executive director, actually showing the board taking action through the language used. In addition, another example, the board voted to approve the FY 22-23 budget, just another commonly seen resolution in board resolutions, sometimes, as we mentioned, in board minutes. So those are just some examples to sort of get you, thinking about these things, thinking about the difference between minutes, between resolutions. And with that said, I'll now talk a little bit about the purpose of having these things. Why do you have board meeting minutes? Why do you have board resolutions? Why do these things matter? And I'll talk about it on two levels. First, I'll talk about it on a micro level. At the micro level, minutes really serve as the official record of a board's proceedings. So, you're providing evidence that the board members were fulfilling their fiduciary duties of care and loyalty. And what we mean by duty of care, especially, is your duty to act with due diligence, toward the work of the board. So as a board member, you're staying informed, you're participating in meetings, you're attending, you're engaging in discussions about key issues, about key strategies for the CAA. And so board meeting minutes can really, and resolutions can really show that you as a board member are fulfilling that duty. In addition to that, you're fulfilling your duty of loyalty, to be loyal to the organization, to put the organization's interests above any individual or personal interests that you have. So the written record contained in minutes, contained in resolutions, really can go a long way to proving that you are doing this. And we'll see some examples of this in a little bit. In addition to that, board meeting minutes can be used to document compliance with funding source and legal requirements. Very important. Something we were also thinking about when we drafted the sample meeting minutes, as well as the index of board resolutions. These can be important indicators to funding sources, to federal, state regulators, that your CAA has maintained compliance with the laws, with the regulations that apply. This includes the CSBG organizational standards, which require CAA boards to take certain actions in your organizational leadership and governance functions. And again, we'll talk about this a little later, but having certain things written in a certain way in your minutes and resolutions really can show compliance with these things, with the organizational standards. And in addition to that, they can serve as evidence in legal proceedings if things do get that far. Just using the example of, fiduciary duty of care. If your board is challenged in a legal proceeding that a decision was wrongly took or recklessly taken, you can point to the board meeting minutes to prove that board members did engage in a deliberative process, did weigh different options, did do their research, did contemplate various reports about a particular decision, so that even if that decision went wrong, you still have that evidence that your board did engage in the process, did fulfill its duty of care, and you can point to that, you can reference that in legal proceedings if it gets there. So that's the micro level. Really, at a macro level, I think at a a bigger picture level about why meeting minutes matter, as they really reflect the level of an organization's governance capability, as well as its capacity. And it's really a window into how the board is operating. How is it meeting? Is it meeting smoothly? Are there certain things that would raise alarms? Does it look like there's some dysfunction on the board? The way your meeting minutes, reflect those kind of things are important as well. Do things like the officers know their roles? Is there significant deference to the executive director being paid? In meeting minutes, you'll see our committees operating efficiently. So our committees presenting reports to the larger board, and then our discussions being had around that. Really providing that window to see how your board is working, how the board is working, and addressing, maybe looking at them later and addressing any issues that may arise. They're also a sign of whether board members are engaged. I think related to some of the things I've mentioned, and it can be a reflection of board engagement in that, is the board struggling with attendance, or to establish a quorum of board members to take decisions. That can be seen in board meeting minutes and resolutions, if there's difficulties with that. And so you can see if there's board engagement issues. Are board members doing things like showing up on time? Are they leaving a lot during the meeting? These are all things that are reflected in the meeting minutes, and so you'll be able to see how engaged the members of the board are, how engaged your board is as a whole. And then again, similar to what's been discussed, is the board engaging in robust discussion of critical issues? Is it doing the things it needs to do to think about the various decisions it's making, having discussions about it, so that it's really fulfilling that oversight function that it has over the organization, over the strategic direction of the organization. All things that are reflected in these minutes. All of these point to the board's work, the capacity of the board to fulfill these functions. And so, speaking of capacity, I think we're going to turn it back to Mary Beth now to talk a little bit more about capacity.
Yes, thank you so much. So when we think about capacity, we can think about capacity on a spectrum. At the far end, the organization has capacity to do, basic practices like engage in the practices that meet organizational standards. But as we start to think about organizations moving beyond just compliance, we start to see agencies who work to institutionalize effective practices that go beyond meeting those standards, and that really sets them up to begin instituting standards of excellence and using practices consistent with the standards of excellence. And we just recognize that an effective board is really essential to the movement on the spectrum from basic capacity to be compliant to capacity to be excellent. And we really know that communities need excellent community action agencies. It's not all about just meeting the requirement. Our communities need and deserve the very best, and that's why we care deeply about moving beyond simply compliance. So I want to talk through kind of a few points on this spectrum, and I want to start by talking about organizational standards specifically on the next slide. Well, we often think of board standards as requirements, but really another way to think about them is as benchmarks for baseline functioning as a community action agency. So let's take a few examples here of what we mean. So at a baseline level, a minimum level of functioning, organizations need to ensure that the board is meeting according to its bylaws. The organization should be providing training to its board. The board should be getting financial reports. These things are just necessary for baseline functioning, and you really can't be excellent if you don't have these basic things in place. But beyond that, on the next slide, let's talk about moving from that word, that meeting the requirements to institutionalizing practices and processes. There's really more to agency functioning than just checking the box. You really could be meeting regularly according to your bylaws, but your board meetings may not be effective. I think we've all, no one in this room has a neat board, but I think we're familiar with that concept. We've heard of those. And so, yeah, you could be minimally compliant, but that is not, again, really what our network needs and what our communities need. So we like to talk about this movement on the spectrum in terms of moving from conscious competence to unconscious competence. That is that the move from, oh, we have a board meeting next month, what all do we need to get to folks, to a process that really supports functioning so that it's not even a thought. So you've got systems in place and knowledge on your team to make the good work happen. For instance, like a designated staff member whose job it is to ensure that you're thinking strategically about your board meetings and getting the things done well in advance, or calendars of activities. And with time, those processes really become institutionalized and things just start to run smoothly. And one of the really neat things that happens is when you've got those good core processes, that frees up your staff capacity to support higher order work and really support a fully engaged board. So seemingly small things like board minutes and board minutes and processes for resolutions can really free up that capacity to focus on that higher order work. Also, your board minutes can help show that movement towards that fully engaged board that you just heard Jonathan speaking of as well. So when you're doing your minutes well, you can then demonstrate your regular engagement and fulfillment of duties as described. So then when those practices are institutionalized and you've got that fine-tuned machine running that we were just talking about, you can then not just think about, am I compliant, but am I best in class? We think of best in class in this instance in terms of not just basic board function, but that the minutes show that board engaged in that high level strategizing, focusing on growth, working effectively within committees and, centering on customer voice and equity. So that's really what we would think of when we see an agency who's moving into that excellence spectrum, excellence side of the spectrum. And in this moment, I want to just flag that if you are interested in learning more about best-in-class practices and you're in community action specifically, you can check out our Pathways to Excellence program and our Community Action Standards of Excellence. I'm going to post a link to that in the chat for you so that you can follow up and learn a little bit more about those practices associated with excellence. There's several practices that involve the board, but they are really overarching for overall agency functioning. So to support agencies in pursuit of the capacity that we're discussing and your support of your pursuit for that fine-tuned machine, CAPLAW released this great new template to help you with board meeting minutes and resolutions, to free up the capacity to do the hard work and the impactful work. So this tool has some great practice pointers and information, and then it has two templates. One is for board minutes and then one is for resolutions. And those are both in Word so that you can modify them as needed for your agency. I want to flag that this tool was funded via our cooperative agreement with the Office of Community Services. And this work is in pursuit of our goal to not just help the network meet standards, but exceed standards. So Caroline is going to talk us through the specifics of this template and how you can use it in your agencies. So with that, I will turn it over to Caroline.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Yeah, so we're really excited about this new resource because we think it's going to, as Mary Beth and John have said, streamline the process of documenting what your board has going on to allow your board members to spend more time on strategic issues and overall planning and decision making, not only the more important stuff, but also the more interesting and engaging stuff. So as has been mentioned, there are two parts to this resource. The first is a template form for meeting minutes. And as you can see here, this is formatted in the same way as CAPLAW's other model policies, with highlighted and bracketed text that is meant to be customized by you and your board in order to fill in the relevant information that's unique to you. And also, it's provided in Microsoft Word because there's really, the whole resource itself is meant to be adapted and changed in accordance with what your board has going on. And you'll see also that we have explanatory footnotes that contain notes on where certain legal requirements come from, or additional considerations that you may want to take into account when you're meeting as a board. That's similar to our model policies as well. So as you're using the tool, we emphasize that you take out the highlighted and bracketed text and replace it with your own, as well as taking out those footnotes. So that's what the meeting minutes looks like. And I'll show you a little bit of what the index of form resolutions look like as well. As you can see here, there's some more formatting involved because many CAAs like to set off, or many boards like to set off resolutions with some indentation or, voted in capital letters, because it calls your attention to it as you are reviewing minutes, for example, if these were incorporated into minutes. So you can see that we have a description in the index of what the resolution below is going to do, or the board action that it's going to reflect, rather. So you see here, designating additional offices, changing the location of the principal office. These are just some basic decisions that your board may engage in, appointing and reviewing the executive director. And so the idea here is, you may take the meeting minutes template and use it to take minutes at your board meeting, or use it to even create your own template that your board can use to take minutes. And then as you're going through and your board is voting on various actions and proposals, you can just copy and paste resolutions from the index of form resolutions right into the meeting minutes to demonstrate what action was taken by the board. So the idea here is to just provide a basic kind of template and something for you to build off of, for your board to build off of, and as it goes through its business and makes decisions. So I also want to say that these resources are not only just for use by the clerk or whoever is taking meeting minutes. We also think that they would make great training resources for the board to learn about its role in the organization, how board meetings work. Maybe you circulate this template to new board members so they can get a feel for what a board meeting might look like. It can help you set expectations and also educate your board members about what it means to sit on the board. Another helpful way to use these form resolutions is, I think it can be difficult when you're sitting in a board meeting to remember exactly what's going on in terms of what the motion on the floor is, for example. And so some agencies will circulate a draft of all of the resolutions that they think are going to be voted on at a board meeting in advance of the meeting, so that your board members can show up and have a piece of paper in front of them, for example, that contains all the language that they're going to be voting on. So that allows your board to get really specific and really practical really quickly, and it helps everyone to be on the same page. No pun intended. So let's talk a little bit more about best practices when it comes to keeping minutes and resolutions. And you'll see that when we do our hypothetical in just a minute, you'll see how these best practices may play out in some real examples. So when it comes to the format and style of meeting minutes and resolutions, there's no one size fits all. There is no required, there's no required format for the most part. And so the important thing is that your agency adopt a style of meeting minutes that you can maintain consistently and that is useful as a reference both for your board and for other individuals who may be coming back to review your board minutes in the future. So you want to have a level of details, you want to be specific enough that this is a useful document that contains information about what was discussed at the meeting, but you don't want it to be a word for word transcript of, every conversation that the board had. The important thing here, as I said, is consistency, because unexplainable changes in format or the level of detail can actually raise suspicion for outside readers or monitors about what was maybe discussed or not discussed. For example, if you provided a detailed account of a board discussion over a minor issue one month, and then the next month you barely have any discussion on a major issue, then a monitor is going to say, I wonder if they really met their duty of care by taking the appropriate amount of time to discuss this big decision. Another point is that if you leave something out of the minutes, folks may just assume, a reader may assume that you didn't discuss it, when in fact that may not be the case. So you can see, as John talked about, that these are really critical documents to your compliance and in addition to organizational culture. So usually you'll see that minutes follow the same kind of format in terms of order of discussion as a meeting agenda that's circulated in advance of the meeting. You may kind of go back and forth between the agenda and the meeting minutes when you're finalizing the minutes. That's very common. So what should be contained in your meeting minutes? As I said, the level of detail can vary, but here's some basic pieces of information that should always be in your meeting minutes. You should include the date, time, and location of the meeting, whether the meeting was a special meeting or emergency meeting, or whether it was a regularly scheduled meeting. You should include the names of all attendees, whether they were board members or guests, as well as when they enter or depart from the room. We'll talk about that in just a minute. I guess the reason that that's important is that you want to show that a quorum of board members was present. Quorum basically is a term that describes the required number of board members who need to be present in order for a board's action to be valid under the bylaws. So usually you'll see a provision in CAA's bylaws that say actions taken at a meeting where 2/3 of the board is present are valid actions of the board. So that means that in order for the board's actions to be legally binding, there need to be 2/3 of board members present at the meeting. And the meeting minutes is where you reflect that that requisite number of board members were present. So it's important to keep that attendance count, even though it seems kind of, from an outside perspective, you could wonder, like, why am I taking attendance at a board meeting? But actually, it's a very critical piece of information. Also, obviously, you want to describe the discussions that the board had and actions taken by the board, which usually are reflected in the form of written resolutions. I guess now that I say written resolutions, I should mention that in some states, boards can act without a meeting by written resolution. And this resource is not intended to address those types of resolutions. It is intended to address resolutions that reflect votes taken at a board meeting and that usually appear either with meeting minutes or in the meeting minutes as part of that document. So so it's important also that you take minutes contemporaneously, meaning at the same time as the board meeting is occurring. This is important because nonprofits need to report on their Form 990 tax return that the board takes contemporaneous minutes. There's no penalty for not taking contemporaneous minutes, but the IRS will kind of raise an eyebrow if you don't say that you take contemporaneous minutes on your tax return. So who is usually responsible for taking board meeting minutes? Usually the most important qualification here is that it should be someone who understands what's going on. That could be a board member, someone like the clerk or secretary. That's kind of the most traditional position. But it could also be a staff member or a board liaison of some kind. It's also something you may want to consider is having two people who alternate or who both take minutes at the same time, and they can compare their notes at the end of the meeting to make sure that they got all the right details. It's, as someone who's actually taken minutes in a meeting before, it can be very difficult to get all the relevant information as it's kind of going on. You're furiously typing away, kind of trying to stay up on the conversation. So sometimes if you double the double the number of minute takers, it kind of halves the load of taking an accurate account of the board meeting. Also, it's important to provide training to the person who's going to be taking minutes at your board meeting. This could, as I mentioned, could be a variety of different positions, but you shouldn't just assume that someone knows how to take good minutes. You could provide them with the opportunity to be the second note taker for a while, and then they become the first note taker to prepare them for being in that first note taker position. But there are resources available online, not only in this CAPLAW resource library resource, but other resources generally about taking minutes. And so it can be helpful to have someone maybe go through an interim training period or something like that. Someone asked in the chat for making notes when a board member leaves and comes back into the room. If we have a virtual meeting and a board member's connection drops, but they come back within a few minutes, should that be noted? That is a really great question. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, many board meetings have been taking place virtually since the pandemic. And yes, I would expect that when you're having a virtual meeting, you should definitely note when a board member's connection drops and when they log back on, because that is an indication of whether they are present and aware of the discussion that's happening in the meeting. Okay, so once you take your board minutes, they should be kept permanently according to IRS rules. That may seem like, it creates quite a document trail, so you may want to think about storing them digitally, but they should be available for inspection by the IRS, funding sources, and if your CAA is subject to state open meetings laws, perhaps members of the public who submit a request for those records. And then I'll just wrap with some tips for taking minutes. We recommend using a minutes template, such as the one that CAPLAW now has provided in our resource library. Clearly indicate when a board action has been taken. You saw earlier that there was an indentation in the index of form resolutions, and it said voted in capital letters. You'll also see it, be it resolved or resolved. Sometimes you'll see some really flowery kind of old legal language that may or may not be necessary, but it helps to kind of set off the resolution from the rest of the description of the minutes. Always document the presence of a quorum and when folks leave and come back. Know what vote is required for certain actions. Some actions under your agency's bylaws may require more than a basic majority vote. And in the case where more than a majority vote is required, you'll want to note that in the minutes, in the resolutions associated with that decision. And so that may also mean reporting votes that were cast against a certain motion, and also noting any individuals who recused themselves from discussions or abstained from voting altogether. So now we are going to turn to a hypothetical that CAPLAW has put together. And John's going to walk us through it while I pull it up on my screen.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. So the first handout that you'll see.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, good.
These are so the hypothetical involves City CAA, which is a hypothetical CAA holding its annual board meeting, and you know, the CAA secretary has taken these notes at the board meeting. And so I'll give you all a second or a couple of minutes to read through this really quick. These are the notes essentially that were taken by the secretary at the meeting. And then the second handout we're going to show you is maybe how this could be reflected using the minutes and resolution, the minutes template and the index of resolutions that we've put out. And so just take a minute to look through these notes, and then we'll talk through the second handout after this. So hopefully if everyone's had a chance to read through this handout of notes, now we're going to pull up the second handout now, which is, you know, essentially how the minutes for this particular meeting would look. As you saw from the notes, the board meeting wound up going into an executive session as well, and we'll talk about this too a little below. But you know, the first thing to note, I think, you know, as you can see, this is agenda item number 4, the executive director's performance and compensation review. Important, you know, meeting minutes often mirror, you know, chronologically the agenda, as I think Caroline mentioned. And so these minutes, you know, are starting under number 4, assuming in the hypothetical that the board meeting having going on for a little bit before this. But as you can see, the chair, it's reflected, the chair called the meeting to order at 1:30 p.m. All board members except for board member 1 are present. Getting back to some things that Caroline was talking about.
Yeah, so John, why would you note that board member 1 is not present?
This gets back to the issues of knowing pretty much at all times what board members are present for purposes of, you know, quorum, you know, ensuring that you have a quorum for decisions that are taken, for actions that are taken. In addition to that, you know, getting back to getting back to what we were discussing with regard to a board member's duty of care to act, act with due diligence and deliberative, engage in a deliberative process, understanding which board members are there and when. If they're not there, obviously there could be, questions raised at a later date. If there's a pattern of consistent either lateness or not attending meetings. So important to know who's there and who's not at all times for those reasons.
So John, if you are at a board meeting and quorum, suddenly you drop below quorum because, 3 people had a family emergency and had to leave, does that mean that the board can't take any more binding action until they come back?
So yeah, I mean, you need essentially, according to, depends on what your state laws say, it depends on what your bylaws say about what's required for each decision, but without a quorum, yeah, you need to essentially wait till the quorum is present before making those kinds of decisions. Just see if there are other. It's a question about executive session that we'll talk about in a minute, I think. With regard to what comes next in the meeting, essentially documenting next, the board proceeded to consider the annual review of the executive director's performance and compensation. Here we see one of those resolutions entered into the minutes, essentially a resolution that was unanimously approved to enter executive session.
John, is there a reason why we don't have the names of the person who made the motion and seconded the motion? Someone asked if it's necessary to include those board member names.
That's not necessary. Getting back to, it's not one size fits all. If your board does include names, okay, sure. That's I think an individual board level decision about whether to do that or not. We haven't included it in the template, but which isn't to say that this is the only way to do things.
Okay.
So this board has entered executive session as they're considering the executive director's performance and compensation reviews. In terms of why, there are a number of reasons why a board might enter an executive session or a session where only board members are present. That means, guests can't be there. Obviously, the executive director, I think you might, be able to think of reasons why an executive director wouldn't be there as the board is discussing that person's performance and compensation for the, compensation review. And so, this board has entered executive session. It's made a motion to do so. And then, as you see, all the non-board members, as is noted in the minutes, have left the meeting and the time at which they've done so. And so, executive session really usually is for discussion of these issues, of confidential issues, of issues that should be, privately discussed between board members. So you don't see here what was discussed essentially at the executive session. The next thing you see is at the time that the board has concluded the executive session and the guests return to the meeting. And then the board members, there's another resolution where the board members are essentially voting on the compensation and benefits package that was discussed in the executive session. And this really gets back to executive sessions being for discussions, but still all the types of decisions that your board's making, actions taken by the board, those are still things that even if it was based on what was discussed in an executive session, need to be reflected in the minutes, in the resolutions that your board has come up with. So that's why this is here at this stage after they come out of the executive session.
So John, just to directly address the question that we got in the chat about a staff person who usually takes the minutes for the board. Yeah. She says she's always asked to leave for executive session. That's totally normal and yep. Okay.
Yeah, totally normal. Executive session involves, typically just the board members themselves. We'll get into this. Maybe I'll just start getting into it now since the question is about this. When board members are in executive session, they still have to take minutes of what goes on in that executive session. However, those minutes are, for those members only, for the board members only. Those minutes, should be taken by someone in that executive session, and should be approved only by should be approved in that, either in that executive session or later by only those people who were involved in the executive session. So by the board members in that executive session. So yes, perfectly normal that a staff member be asked to leave because they're not essentially a part of the board for these purposes. And so that's a perfect segue into the executive session minutes that are included. They're included in the handout, but they would not be included in the regular meeting minutes of your board, just here for example purposes. And this really talks about what was discussed essentially in that executive session, how the board members essentially talked about the executive director's performance, what that executive director's performance had looked like over the course of the year, and they obviously talk through some of the evaluations they received and things like that, and weighed those up. As you can see here, the board member at 1:50, board member 1 returned to the meeting and returned to that executive session to participate. So that's good that person was able to return. And then the board discussed things around new performance goals for the executive director, and the compensation package. And so you see how they weighed different options and considered different things with regard to compensation there, including what's the sort of the market for executive directors' salary in the area. And so important to have those pieces of information to point to and look at as a board. And so there's an example of how executive session minutes could look. As I mentioned, those sometimes, in terms of approving those minutes, so regular board meeting minutes will often be approved at the next board meeting. And so there'll be essentially a resolution to approve board meeting minutes at the next board meeting. For executive sessions, this is sometimes done at the end of the executive session. Since all the board members are there, the person taking minutes will sort of report back about them, and it can be approved there. But again, it can also be approved at a later date as well, provided it's only those board members who are voting to approve it. And so, yeah.
John, we got a question in the chat about executive session. If you're doing a virtual meeting and you're going into executive session, do you have to create a separate room for the private meeting or simply excuse non-board members from the meeting?
Yeah, I think, I think this is kind of a logistical question. I think the important thing for the purposes of meeting the requirements of an executive session would be to ensure that only those people who are supposed to be at an executive session are there. So whether that involves essentially asking everyone to leave the Zoom meeting or whatever you're on, and that you would call them when you're done or something like that, or having a separate room to go into, as long as you as a board are sort of only meeting as board members in an executive session, I think would be the important component there.
Yeah,
sure
I think you would probably not want to do something like, say, turn off your camera and mute,
right,
because you don't know if they're still sitting there listening to the executive session. You really want to know that they've left the virtual space. And so I would definitely say that they should probably leave and come back, but you may not need to enter a breakout room or something like that if you're using Zoom. Another question we got is, if executive session is utilized for the ED's performance review and compensation, and the entire board is not present, then for the org standards, how should that be reported in the regular minutes?
I think in the regular minutes, you need to reflect what happened. You need to reflect who was there. And so if the entire board wasn't there, that needs to be included in the regular minutes. You need to, document in terms of attendance who was there and who was not, and go about it that way. I think, it should be reported, that the board did engage in that compensation and performance review. And that some members were not there, and those were noted who were not there.
Yeah, I think this also touches on what we have here in these minutes, which is that when you go into executive session, here, I'm going to zoom back out again, just so you can see the whole document a little bit more. So we have here the regular minutes, that's with 4 and 5. And then down here, after the line, we have the executive minutes, executive session minutes. And so when you go into executive session, when all non-board members leave the room at 1:35, that's when you jump down to the executive session minutes. And these are, you take your executive session minutes. And then you'll see here that the board votes to adjourn the executive session, and we jump back into the regular minutes to show that the board approved the compensation and benefits package for the ED in the form discussed in the executive session. And they attach the comparability data. At this point, you could have, a brief description of the compensation that's been approved and the benefits themselves, but you shouldn't include a detailed details about what was talked about in executive session, because obviously that would defeat the purpose of the executive session. So you'll want the final conclusion to be in the regular minutes, but the details and the nitty-gritty of the discussion to be in the executive session minutes.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions right now, from anyone in the chat, but just wanted to make sure I mentioned and highlight something that Caroline, you mentioned, when you were discussing sort of the form that these take and how much detail to add. I think it's important to note that I think each board will have its own thoughts, opinions on how detailed to get. We'll choose to different things on how detailed to get with regard to how much information it's including about discussions and things like that in the minutes. But we've seen some with extremely really detailed minutes, some with really really sort of bare bones type minutes with just resolutions essentially included and attendance and things like that. I think it's key to include definitely the actions and decisions that your board is taking, who's there, who's not, when that's happening. But some context also I think is important to include. And I think the resources themselves, the introductions to the template, as well as the introductions to the index of resolutions, really I think are an important thing to go through when you take these in, because I think they really speak to the different ways in which this can be done, and the different ways that you can add with different types of language, context, to even the board resolutions that are there, and include context in different ways by adding even just a few words here and there about a particular resolution and what was discussed or debate, or what was discussed or debated with regard to it, and including decisions about how formal to get with the resolutions. Also, there's a good discussion about that in the index introduction. So
yeah, I wanted to say one more thing also about, just to bring it back to the org standards. There are many different, the org standards are applied to all different aspects of a CAA. And so not every org standard is going to be able to be met by a board action or board meeting minutes. But there are some org standards that are very suited to being met through a resolution or meeting minutes. One is, the board reviewing the strategic plan, the board approving budgets, the board accepting the community assessment. All of those are actions that you can demonstrate compliance with the org standards just by including a written resolution in your meeting minutes. And so what we're trying to do with this resource is just make that process as easy as possible for you guys. Did you want to add anything to that, Mary Beth?
I think you really just covered it. That's exactly right. And, you said this earlier, this template is meant to make your life easier. It's not a requirement that you have to do it exactly like this, but this template really gives you some tools to be able to easily document those things that are required, but also hopefully help you move from that conscious competence to unconscious competence. When these things just become normal, that builds your capacity to engage in excellence practices. And I just had one other point to Jonathan, when you were talking about the level of detail that's required, that's also on that spectrum, right? You can meet the minimum requirement. You know, we all want to make sure that we are compliant. That is very important. But your minutes are that opportunity to show the full engagement of your board, fully show that the board is strategizing and working on that next level that we see in organizations of excellence. So just keep those things in mind as you're, you know, working in this space.
Great. Well, if you have any more questions, feel free to share them in the chat. We have a couple more minutes here, and we'd love to help talk through anything that's on your mind.
Caroline, I wonder if y'all wanted to chat about how to find this resource. I did put a link to it in the chat, but maybe you want to talk about your new resource library.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, CAPLAW has actually, now that I have my screen up, I'll just type it in, resources.caplaw.org. This is our new resource library. It's very beautiful and we're very proud of it. And you can find this resource. I think it's still on our first page because it was issued pretty recently. You can find it down here, template meeting minutes and index of form resolutions. And when you click on it, you can open, it has a little, description of the resource, and you can view a PDF introduction to the resource. You can view the template of board meeting minutes, or you can view the index of form resolutions. And our new resource library is also searchable, and different resources are tagged with different keywords. So obviously this resource relates to the board of directors, so it's tagged in that way. It relates to governance, meetings, and minutes, and it was released in 2021. So you'll see that all on our resources. You can also see related resources if you scroll down here to the other tiles that are here in the resource library. So we hope that you'll give it a download and let us know if it's, what you like and don't like about it. We want to know how to be more helpful to you in making governance more of an easy and strategically useful tool for your organization. So let us know what you think. Anything else to add, John or Mary Beth?
I'll just add, I mentioned the resource library on a recent call, and talked about how much fun it was when we first put it up, how, CAPLAW, at CAPLAW, we were just having a lot of fun going through it. And I think someone mentioned only CAPLAW could have fun with a resource, going through a resource library. So if you love resources, you'll have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, we're a bunch of nerds over here, so we love it. You can click on this little tool in the corner to take you back to the front page. And we even filmed a tutorial for you guys, a video to show you how it works. So you can watch that here.
It really is a beautiful site, guys, and it's super usable. So thank you so much for showing us how to find these new resources and for the new minutes tool, minutes and index of resolutions tool. There we go.
It's a mouthful. It's okay. It's a mouthful.
So with that, guys, we are at time. So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We did put a link to the evaluation for our session today. So please go ahead and take that. We will follow up with the recording and the slides, and they will be available on our website. So I want to say thank you to all of you. Thank you to CAPLAW. And, reach out to us if you have any questions or any needs. We're here to help. So thank you all. Please take care. Hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.